Good afternoon and welcome to another IP Day Webinar Wednesday. I'm June Rawl, the Director for Florida IP Day. Back in December, we hosted a webinar titled 4 Critical Factors That Impact Your NRS Performance Data. Based on tremendous feedback and requests from the field, we are now bringing you part 2 to this series. Our goal today is to provide you with a more in-depth view regarding these factors: enrollment, attendance and retention, post-testing rates, performance. Today, Maria Gutierrez is back with us from Miami-Dade County Public Schools. She's an administrator there and one of our top lead state trainers for IP Day. Today, Maria is going to walk us through some strategies and some best practices that you can immediately implement in order to begin moving your data in the right direction. But before we get started, let's briefly go over a few things. If you have a question, you may type it into the Q&A option and hit the send button. Feel free to post them throughout the entire presentation. If we don't get to all your questions today, you will receive a follow-up email with the response. Just remember, your microphones are muted and you are in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is recorded like all IP Day presentations webinars and will be available for access within 48 hours. All the materials presented today are loaded on the IP Day website and ready for access. So Maria, I know you've got a lot to talk about, so I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for bringing us part 2.
Thank you, June. Good afternoon and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Today I have a special guest with me, Ivania Lanuza. She is an expert on data analysis and she will be supporting throughout the webinar. In December, we held the webinar training titled 4 Critical Factors That Impact Your NRS Data. The information was pretty intense, so we are providing this additional training in order to expand on the previously provided content. In today's session, we will specifically continue to walk the talk as we delve deeper into these 4 critical factors and expand on previously presented strategies and best practices to help us move our data needle. Now, as a quick review, the 4 critical factors impacting our NRS performance include enrollment, attendance and retention, the post-testing rate, and of course, post-testing performance. We will explore strategies, best practices, and resources for each of the 4 critical factors, and then go over a critical timeline of events chart. Finally, we will close out the session with a reflection and a very brief Q&A session, time permitting. Now, recall that in order to move our data, we must first and foremost keep the NRS formula in mind. Looking at the simplified version of the formula, I want you to remember that we are looking to gain a minimum of 1 LCP per student, per program, per WITIS year. To figure out our NRS performance percentage for a specific program, take the numerator in the formula and divide it by the total number of students who were enrolled in the program. It's easy to see the issue with which we're all faced right now, right? The fact that you are not dividing the number of students who gain an LCP over the total number of students who post-test. You are, in fact, dividing that number of students with 1 LCP gain over the total number who were enrolled in the program, regardless of whether or not they post-tested. Let's review the attainment goal for each of the 4 factors as set forth by the state. With regards to enrollment, the minimum goal should be maintaining at least 100% of your prior WITIS year's enrollment. Your retention rate needs to be at no less than 70%, and this is the case because retention, as you know, is directly tied to your post-testing rate. Your post-testing performance rate is 43% for ESOL and 41% ABE this year. Now, let's look at how you can begin to move your data in order to achieve the desired outcomes. What do you remember about enrollment? Well, first of all, a student is considered to be officially enrolled in a program for the purpose of funding once he has received a minimum of 10 direct instructional hours. It's actually 12 hours. However, the state automatically counts 2 hours for testing. Remember also that orientation hours do not count as direct instructional hours. Additionally, if a student is withdrawn from your program and does not return prior to 90 days of his or her withdrawal date, then this student now counts twice. In other words, he counts as 2 students, which means he hits twice on your denominator. Now, the bulk of the adult program fundings, comes from student enrollment. So you want to be sure to capture and retain students in order to maximize program funding. Enrollment, however, is a double-edged sword. On one side, the higher your enrollment, the higher your funding. On the other side, remember that the denominator on your NRS Performance formula is the total number of students enrolled. The more students you have enrolled in a program, the harder you have to work to ensure that they all remain enrolled, complete the program, and post-test successfully. Now, even though the main focus of this training is on increasing your NRS performance, program growth is vital to success. As your program improves and grows, and as it gains a reputation for excellence, and as students share positive experiences via word of mouth and social media, your NRS performance will be positively impacted. Now, let's briefly go over 10 simple tips that will help you grow your student enrollment. Number 1 is to actively recruit. Recruit at local high school graduations, school ceremonies and events, community activities and fairs. Visit local businesses and request permission to recruit and disseminate program information. Keep a running log of your recruitment efforts and make sure to ask new students what brought them to your program. 2, develop, promote, and regularly update your web page. Ensure that you have a web page for your school with program offerings, activities calendar, contact information, etc. Information that is useful and current. Now look at this picture. Which web page would you explore? The small one on the left or the one on the right? This one has the school name, easy to read drop-down menus at the top. It has home, about us, admissions, programs, financial aid, student resources, employee resources. It highlights new student registration, an online appointment system, high school application. For me, that's a no-brainer. Let's look at number 3. Regularly use multiple sources of social media. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Snapchat, and other social media platforms can help you market yourself and stay connected with interested or target groups. Now, before we continue to explore specific strategies and best practices for recruiting students, let's look at a simple resource that you can easily create in either Excel or Access to gauge the effectiveness of your recruiting efforts. This information is critical if you are to develop an effective recruiting plan. Again, you can find a full-page sample of this spreadsheet in the Companion Resource Handbook. This spreadsheet serves to document which recruiting or marketing activity was effective in capturing a new enrollee. Some of the examples listed on this drop-down menu include word of mouth, TV ad, radio ad, social media, school or community activity, or even an on-site recruiter. Feel free to add any categories specific to your school site. Now notice that in the last column to the right, you can document whether or not the student has reached the minimum 10 hours of direct instruction for funding purposes. Remember, if a student is present less than 10 hours, you will not receive any funding for that student. Recruiting students is not enough. You need to retain them and get them to successfully complete your program. Now 4, you're going to show the career benefit of the curriculum. What is the value of attending and completing your program? What unique services can you provide? Articulate how your courses translate beneficially to the workforce. This is key. At number 5, deliver flexible, blended, and accelerated learning options. Tell students you offer many ways to learn and include any supporting software programs that you offer. Do you offer tutoring for students who need additional assistance or who are returning from an absence and need additional support? At number 6, train all staff to respond in a timely manner. Folks, we already know customer service is key. 7, you're going to share student success stories. Highlight student success stories on your web page or through social media. Post them around the school. This sample visual identifies the career technical options available within a specific district. A visual like this constantly reinforces student success and motivates students to complete the AGE program and continue their path to higher earnings. At number 8, you are going to play to your strengths. What are your unique strengths? For example, do you provide career counseling to assist students into transitioning to post-secondary educational options? At number 9, you're going to facilitate the enrollment process. Streamline it whenever possible. Have an appointment system set up so that students are not standing in line, wasting valuable time. Post required documentation at the registration counter and on your website. At number 10, again, we're talking about customer service, and customer service. Customer service isn't something that just happens by displaying posters. Be specific with all employees as to what customer service means at your school site. How do you handle irate students or customers, for example? Request feedback from your students. Have frank conversations where they feel comfortable in helping you identify areas for improvement. Now, let's move to critical factor number 2. What do you remember about attendance and retention? We know the ultimate goal here is retention. However, we are all well aware of the fact that students who have attendance issues are more likely to drop out of a program than those with few or no attendance issues. Even though we want to retain every student every trimester for NRS purposes, we need to be strategic. And we need to primarily target those students within the width is here who do not gain a functional level from one trimester to the next. Remember that any student who does not post-test, even if he's been withdrawn from the program, is still counting on your denominator because he is part of your total enrollment. When encountering a situation where a student does not earn you an LCP, you need to heavily target the student to ensure that he continues to post-test until he does, in fact, make that measurable skill gain. You basically have the entire width here to move a student from one functional level to the next. If you fail to do so within that width here, the student will count against you in determining your NRS performance percent. Look at the 3 examples here. Notice that you stop targeting the student once he earns an LCP. When this happens, the student is off your radar. Doesn't mean you're not going to try to keep moving the student along. It just means that he's not on your target right now. Now, what can you do to increase your attendance and improve student retention? Your post-testing rate is set at a minimum of 70%, so your retention rate must be at a minimum 70% as well. Some strategies and best practices you can implement in order to improve your student attendance and retention rate include market attendance as a priority in your school, post posters, set up an attendance wall, and by the way, there's a full page graphic of this shot here and that you can reproduce in the companion resource handbook. Next, connect with students via email, texting. The main benefit of instant messaging is just that, it's instant. With IM, messages are usually read within 90 seconds of being sent. That's pretty telling. And number 3, keep morale high with good instruction. Set high, attainable goals and define objectives. Hold award ceremony, differentiate instruction. Allow students to work together and provide specific feedback and offer opportunities to improve. Number 4, boost personalized learning. Use technology. Assess as you go. Use the DI plans or individualized instructional student plans, which we're now calling ISPs. Now, at number 5, you're going to implement an incentive program. Now, remember that your efforts will be most effective if they are part of a comprehensive approach. So reach out to your students, establish a school-wide culture of attendance, and emphasize student engagement throughout the trimester. Here are some ideas. You have a sample chart on the left that you can recreate to monitor enrollment, attendance, and functional level gains by class. The chart on the right is slightly different but still serves to recognize students. Adapt either chart to fit your needs. 6, provide an instructional support system for students returning after a period of absence or for students who are re-enrolling after having been withdrawn from the program. Maybe you can provide extra lab time before and after class, assign tutors, offer online follow-up lessons or activities. At 7, all communities are different, but you can always find ways to address issues that impact student attendance. If you have issues with students getting to school, you may be able to connect students so that they can carpool, or you may even be able to obtain free public transportation passes. Do the research and find a solution. Conduct daily class counts. Don't just limit yourself to once a day. Try to count heads twice in a given period. Usually 30 minutes into the class and 30 minutes prior to the end of class is best. This encourages students to be on time and not leave early. Share this data with teachers. Here you have a sample chart that you can adapt to fit your needs. At number 9, you're going to designate someone to regularly call students when they're absent. Rotate clerical personnel around to make daily calls. Now remember, every student who withdraws from your program or does not gain sufficient instructional hours to post-test or do well on the test counts against you. At number 10, you're going to track absences, withdrawals, and reentries. Now, number 10 goes hand in hand with number 9. Look at the sample spreadsheet on this slide. You have a larger version, by the way, in your resource handbook. Meet with your leadership and administrative team and decide when you will contact students for their attendance. You should absolutely be contacting every single student who withdraws. In most situations, you'll be able to find a solution for the student and get him to re-enroll in the course. And now we're up to critical factor number 3. Now, what do you recall regarding the post-testing rate? When we talk about post-testing, we can safely say that most programs throughout the state post-test students once at the end of the trimester. Some students withdraw from a program without post-testing and then return and are tested without first re-enrolling in the course. In situations like these, you forego the possibility of earning a reportable LCP. Now take notice of the third bullet, which refers to students who post-test after the course end date. When this happens, if you post-test the student 7 days or more after the course end date, you may still report the LCP for the following term. The gain still counts as long as the student re-enrolls and we're in the same period of participation. The problem is at the end of the WITIS year when the LCP will be assigned to the following WITIS year. Count instructional hours from P-test to post-test when determining student eligibility for post-testing. This means that you can accumulate instructional hours across trimesters. Now, the third critical factor impacting your NRS performance data deals with how you can increase your post-testing rate. Again, there are 3 components. 1, establish an ongoing post-testing program. 2, re-enroll withdrawn students prior to post-testing. And 3, try to post-test within 7 calendar days of the end of course date. Let's look at each of these individually along with some resources that can facilitate the process. First of all, establish an ongoing post-testing program. Consider the minimum number of instructional hours required for a student to be eligible for post-testing. Be sure that you adhere to the test publisher's recommendation as well as your district's testing policy guidelines. This is very important. Now let's explore how having an ongoing testing program increases the number of opportunities that each student will have toward gaining an LCP within the WITIS year. This chart you see here represents 3 trimesters in the 2019-20 year. Note that this is just an example and may not be 100% representative of the number of instructional days and hours of instruction per day for your district and school site. If there are 81 instructional days in trimester 1 and a student attends 3 instructional hours per day, he will have an opportunity to test up to 4 times that trimester. In trimester 2, there are 62 instructional days. At 3 hours per day equals approximately 186 total instructional hours. When we divide 186 by 60 hours of instruction, you can see that a student can test up to 3 times. In trimester 3, a student can also test up to 3 times. Overall, when we look at the entire 2019-20 WITIS year, as represented in this chart, a student has a total of 10 opportunities to post-test and gain an LCP. This is very different from the usual 3 opportunities. By increasing the number of post-testing opportunities, you are increasing your ability to gain an LCP from your students. Now, let's address some challenging issues, right? What happens if you know that a student is going to be leaving your program and not returning? Well, first, confirm that the student has accumulated a minimum of 40 hours of instruction. For most test publishers, this is the minimum requirement. If this is the case and you know that the student is ready for post-testing, like for example has mastered at least 70% of the tested content, then consult with your administrator and obtain approval to post-test him prior to departure. Another possible situation is what to do with students who have not yet post-tested by the end of a trimester. The recommendations are the same as for those students who leave early and are not planning on returning. Always be sure to check with your district regarding specific district guidelines. Now, under post-testing rate, the second key component has to do with re-enrolling students prior to post-testing. It's critical for you to re-enroll returning students before post-testing them, or you may forego earning the LCP. The third and last key component to increasing your post-testing rate is to ensure that you try to post-test students within 7 calendar days of the end of course date. This is especially critical at the end of the trimester. In this example, the course ends on April 8th. You see that the student returns to post-test 24 days after the course end date, which also happens to be the new WITIS year. If the student gains a functional level on this test, the LCP will not be reported for the current 1920 WITIS year. It will instead be reported in the next 2021 WITIS year. And this will impact your 1920 performance rate. Next, we're finally at critical factor number 4. Let's see, what do you remember regarding post-testing performance? Well, if the student does not post-test, this will definitely negatively impact your post-testing performance. But at this time, let's take a look at the instructional component for a minute. Students who are not well prepared to test will test poorly. We've addressed instruction and instructional resources in numerous IPDAY webinars, and this is not what this training is about. With regard to instruction, what we need to keep in mind is that it must be data and competency or standards driven. Also, recall the importance of post-testing frequently. Post-testing multiple times means the student has multiple opportunities to make a functional level gain. Additionally, consider that the more often a student is exposed to testing, well, obviously the more comfortable and less anxious he will be. Now, let's look at some ways we can increase our students' post-testing performance. Remember that when we refer to post-testing performance, we're talking about the percent of students who move from one functional level to the next, or higher, when post-testing. Here's an overview of 6 simple strategies you can apply. 1. Know the breakdown of the test. 2. Know the post-test form and level for each student. 3. Create and use individualized instructional student plans, or ISPs. Integrate computer-assisted instruction, CAI, as part of a blended learning program whenever possible. 5. Provide intensive test prep and remediation, and we call that bootcamp, and do so prior to post-testing. And 6, ensure that 75 to 80% mastery of all tested content is in place. Definitely make sure that they have at least a minimum of 70%. Now, these are great strategies, but let's be a little bit more specific about how to implement them and what resources you can use. Now, The first key component to increasing our students' post-testing performance is to know the breakdown of the test. So you need to know what is tested at each level. How many questions are there? How much time do they have? If you are familiar with the format of the test, the amount of time you have to complete it, and the question types that you will encounter, then chances are you're going to be less stressed about taking the test. Be sure that you and your students are familiar with the structure of the TABE and CASAS tests. In the first part of this training held back in December 2019, I went over the breakdown of each of the TABE and CASAS tests in great detail. I will not be reviewing this information today since our focus is mainly on strategies, best practices, and resources. However, I do strongly urge you to refer to the companion resource handbook, which has full-size copies of the structure and content for both the TABE and CASAS. Keep in mind that students only need to focus on the breakdown of their post-test. In other words, they first need to know the level and form of the test with which they will be post-tested. So this brings us to number 2. CASAS has a report called the Next Assigned Test, in this report, it specifically identifies the test level and form with which the student will be post-tested for each subject, reading and listening. Talk to your test chair in order to obtain this report. So when it comes to TABE 11-12, things get a little bit more complicated. How do you determine the form and test level? With regards to the form, we already addressed this in the December webinar when we first identified how many minimum instructional hours were recommended based on the NRS level. So we're talking about Form 11 or 12. If you want to keep it simple, just alternate forms. If you pre-test with Form 11, then post-test with Form 12 and vice versa. Now follow the chart above to determine the level at which a student will post-test. Remember, you must always retest the student who scores an NA in place of the scale score. Now, if you want more details on post-testing, you can check out the DRC website at tabetest.com. So we're now at number 3 under post-testing performance. If you've been attending our webinar trainings as well as our face-to-face trainings, you know that we are currently field testing individualized instructional student plans, ISPs, for TABE 11-12 reading, language, and math in selected schools throughout the state. Look for the new ISPs, which IPTE will begin to release starting June of this year. These new plans are aligned to the new TABE 11-12 individual student profile reports, as well as to the TABE blueprints and college and career readiness standards. Now, unfortunately, individualized ISPs for the CASAS test are not currently available, but you can use the CASAS individual student profile report in order to obtain specific testing data per student. All right, so let's look at number 4 under post-testing performance. Most educational programs today are currently enhanced with computer-assisted instruction. Now, simply put, this refers to instruction or remediation presented on a computer. I'm not going to get into all the ways that CAI can enhance your programs, but I do want to emphasize the importance of a few characteristics, such as immediate feedback, self-paced learning, differentiated instruction, and test practice. So whichever CAI program you select, just be sure that it is closely aligned to the standards and competencies that are post-tested. Let's look at number 5 next. Intensive test prep and remediation prior to post-testing will give your students a sense of confidence as well as an opportunity to obtain higher test scores. Practice tests are designed to mimic the actual test, which makes them excellent preparation tools. Enforce practice test time restrictions so that students practice managing their time throughout the actual test. Next, target non-mastered content on a student's ISP. If the student does not have a plan, you can refer to any practice test offered through your online programs or even teacher-created tests. The idea is to focus only on what is pending mastery. So designate approximately 10 to 12 hours of intensive test prep and remediation, which we call bootcamp, and anything beyond this, honestly, is overkill and it will lose its effectiveness. Now, let's look at a sample template that you can use to implement and monitor an ongoing bootcamp program. And here you go. So this first template is an ongoing bootcamp calendar. Now, you can see that we're simply addressing one ESOL course and one combined ABE course per week. This is an easy start to setting up your ongoing boot camp. So as you get accustomed to the process, you'll be able to rotate boot camps more frequently. For example, rather than schedule 1 week per course, you may be able to schedule a boot camp every 3 or 4 days, depending on the number of hours. Also, be sure that you send your students to test once they've completed their scheduled boot camp hours, if they have mastered at least 70% of the tested content. It's critical that you follow through with this testing piece. And by the way, there's a page-size sample of this in your resource handbook. Now here is a bootcamp schedule template that you can use once you've identified which students have gained the minimum number of required instructional hours and have mastered at least 70% of the tested content. Now let's look at some of the information included in this example. At the top, you can see that we're working with the September to December trimester. We're in the month of September and we're creating the bootcamp for week 3. Now, I've identified the specific dates and the testing date as well. The pullout time for each of these dates is the same as the class time, 6 to 9 p.m. in this case. We're pulling students out of Mr. Liu's ESOL 1 course. The assigned interventionist who will be providing the bootcamp instruction is Karen Jones. I have also listed the names of the students who will be participating in the bootcamp. Notice that there's a space for a maximum of 8 names. So why? Well, keep your groups as small as possible for maximum impact. In the last column on the right, you can see the names of the students who have not gained the minimum 70% mastery, right? You see that one student who is not yet ready? Well, this student should return to class and get reassigned to the next bootcamp round for her level, and it's ESOL 1 in this example. Now, one of the most frequent questions I get regarding bootcamp is, okay, who is going to provide the instruction? Well, the ideal bootcamp situation is a pull-out module. So for this to happen, you know that you have to have a designated person for bootcamp. And this is honestly why we rotate groups. Finally, it's best to stick to one subject area and one test level at a time when doing bootcamp. Now, as your students go through bootcamp, please remind your interventionists of the following pieces of information. First of all, group students during bootcamp based on commonly failed content. Emphasize heavily weighted competencies, meaning those with the highest number of questions. Address those competencies that are closest to mastery first. In other words, if a student has 65% score on a particular competency and a 25% score on another, select the competency that he is closest to mastering first. This will give him a greater possibility of gaining that LCP because he's already has some knowledge or understanding of the competency. So remember, you have to be strategic. Even if a student has accumulated the necessary instructional hours for post-testing, you must also ensure that he's met at least a minimum 70% mastery on all the tested competencies. You know, I prefer myself to hold them to 75 to 80% mastery just to give them a little wiggle room. All right, so I have shared numerous strategies, best practices, and resources that I hope you can immediately begin to apply and implement in order to move your data needle in a positive direction. But before we conclude this webinar session, I'd like to review some critical dates. Look at this critical timeline of events. If you miss some of these dates, you will miss earning the LCP. Now, we can all agree that timelines are important. Deadlines are important. Scheduling details are important. So if you make an error concerning any of these, you will forego earning your LCP. In other words, even if the student technically gains a functional level when post-testing, it will not count towards your NRS performance percent. So let's just briefly address these talking points. Number one, you have to be sure that you pre-test your students before you enroll them for any course. 2, share with your registrar that any student who is withdrawn and returns to class within 30 days needs to be re-entered in the same section number. Now, you don't have to worry too much about the why behind this. Just be mindful and share the information with your registrar. Now, number 3, this is a biggie. Any student who returns after 90 days of being withdrawn, that means within the same WITIS year, counts twice on your denominator. So please remember this and be sure that you make every effort to recapture a student prior to these 90 days. Always re-enter returning students before post-testing them, or you will forego earning the LCP. At number 5, you prepare your students for post-testing. So provide remediation approximately 10 to 15 hours prior to post-testing. This intervention, or bootcamp as we call it, should address non-mastered content reflected on the student's individualized instructional student plan, or ISP. And you will receive more training on this, by the way, when we release the individualized ISPs later on this year. At number 6, be sure to establish an ongoing post-testing program, which is critical to increasing your post-testing performance. And again, this will provide your students with multiple opportunities to gain a functional level, or LCP, not just 3, 1 per trimester. At number 7, even though the goal regarding post-testing is to establish a system that supports post-testing throughout the trimester, there will always be students who are left at the end of the trimester who have not yet demonstrated a measurable skill gain and are not eligible to proceed to the next functional level. Please, it is important that these students are not forgotten and that they're provided with one last opportunity to make that functional level gain. And finally, at number 8, remember to post-test the student within 7 days of the end of course date if the LCP is to be reported within the same term. Well, we have come to the end of our webinar. Now, at this time, I'd just like to ask you to take a few moments to analyze and reflect on the information that has been presented in this webinar and take it one step further. So first of all, change how you look at enrollment, attendance, retention, and post-testing the remainder of the year. Look at key data points that were presented throughout the webinar and how they can impact your NRS performance. Redesign or participate in redesigning existing procedures regarding recruitment and enrollment, attendance and retention, and establishing an ongoing post-testing program that will increase your site's post-testing rate as well as post-testing performance. Review all of the information covered in this webinar and look through the companion resource handbook. Share this information with teachers, administrators, and district personnel, and you become the expert. Reflect and make a change. Finally, ask yourself, what is working especially well at my school site and what isn't? Speak to your administrative team and discuss these key points that impact all personnel at your school site. Make an active decision to initiate and support changes that will move your NRS performance data. All right, so this concludes our webinar for today. So at this time, I believe we have a few minutes to answer a few questions, June.
Yes, you have them in the Q&A. Would you like me to read them to you, or?
Let's see, I've got one right here. It says, how are you defining trimester? Okay, and this is from Melissa Perry. All right, so we define a trimester. We have a calendar by district. In some districts, you have 3 trimesters a year, and these are designated calendars that are approved through the district, and usually they're they're bargaining unions. You can check with your district and see what is your calendar start and end dates for each of the trimesters for adult ed. You may have some mini trimesters that jump from the middle of the first trimester, for example, through the middle of the second trimester, but this is less common. You should have a set calendar for your particular district. We have another question here. What happens when a student tests and drops a level? How does that affect the LCP? Well, if they drop a level and they are in an ESOL course, it is not recommended that the A be placed back in a lower level course. They will still have to have the same goal as far as attaining the LCP. So you don't lose the LCP, but you don't gain the same LCP twice. So the student will still have to score at the original LCP goal to get that next level LCP. I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense to you, June? I think I lost June.
No, I'm here. Yes, it does. Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. So who can I contact for more information about Bootcamp? Well, June, I'm going to let you handle that one.
Yeah, maybe this would be a great webinar that we could do some more professional development on. So I see the contact here. I'll reach out to these people and get some more information to them.
Okay, excellent. And then the last question I'll address today is, where is the resource handbook? And that is posted on the IPDAY website. June, I'm going to leave you to close for today. I think you have some information regarding feedback you want to address first.
Yes, thank you, Maria. We're receiving a lot of good feedback, so I appreciate it. And I know that we have colleges on the call as well, so we know that your reporting schedule is different, but the information remains the same. Okay, at this point, we have 3 short questions that are on your screen. If you would please take a minute to answer them. Your feedback is very important to us, so we would like to have your feedback. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you can join us next week as we explore some pre-apprenticeships programs that are being conducted in one of our counties. I think you'll enjoy the presentation. It's titled, "Can I Have a Pre-Apprenticeship Program in Adult Education?" Until then, I wish you a great rest of the day. And Maria, thank you so much to you and your staff for a great presentation today.
All right, you're very welcome. My pleasure. Have a great evening.